The wolves circled closer, their eyes burning in the twilight. Against a weathered cedar post, Elara stood bound and bleeding, her strength fading, but her resolve unbroken. The post leaned slightly on the frozen slope, its splintered edges rough against her back. Ropes cut deep into her wrists, forcing her arms high above her head until her hands had gone numb. Her ankles were tied close together, leaving her upright but unsteady, every breath shallow from the strain. The wind carried dust and a bitter chill down from the northern rim. It sliced through her torn cotton dress, pulling heat from her body until her teeth pressed hard against each other to keep from chattering. Hours had already passed, long enough for her shoulders to burn, for her calves to cramp so tightly that each shift of weight sent sparks of pain through her legs. Long enough, too, for despair to whisper in the corners of her mind. But she had made her decision when they left her here. She would not cry, and she would not beg. If this was the way her story ended, she would meet it standing. The wolves seemed to know. They lingered in the brush and sage, their low bodies melting into the colors of dusk. She could hear their paws against the hard ground when the wind stilled. They were patient hunters, and she was no more than prey tied and waiting. When one crept too near, she caught the faint glint of fangs before it slipped back into shadow. Elara's throat was dry, her lips cracked, but her thoughts remained sharp. She replayed every step that had brought her here, not because she needed reminding, but because memory was all she had left to hold. Her cousin's face lingered in that memory, his voice accusing, his hand clutching the Springfield rifle that should have been hers. Lies carried weight in their band. He had told the others she had shamed the family, that she had sold herself to outsiders. Some believed him, some didn't care. Either way, they tied her to this post and left her for the wolves. Her chest rose once, slow, steady, defying the fear inside her ribs. "Not like this," she whispered, her voice carried off by the wind. The sky above was thinning into purple, the last warmth of the day fading from the rocks. Soon the cold would deepen, and soon the wolves would grow bold enough to close the distance. She tried to picture her father's face then, to remember his voice when he handed her the rifle for the first time. The memory steadied her as much as the post. The air shifted. A new sound wove into the wind. A horse's hooves, faint but clear, working steady over the hard ground. Her eyes snapped up. For an instant, she thought it might be them, returning to finish what they started. But no, the sound carried differently. One rider, alone. The wolves heard it too. They lifted their heads, ears twitching, their focus split now between her and the new arrival. Elara's heart pressed hard against her ribs. Whoever he was, he would see her. The question that chilled her deeper than the wind was not whether he would stop, but whether he would ride on. From the rise to the south, Elias Hartman reined in his horse. He had spent the day moving through low washes, the kind of wandering he did now more out of habit than purpose. Once he had ridden as a scout for the cavalry, finding passes and waterholes, measuring the land for men who fought wars in it. Those years had left him with more memories than he cared to keep. Men bleeding into dust, cruelty done when no eyes were watching, the hollow sound of orders obeyed. He thought he had left it all behind when he buried his wife and sold what little land remained. Since then, he carried no destination, only miles beneath his horse's hooves. But the sound he heard now was not one he could ignore. Wolves. The howls were layered, carrying across the barren ground, all bent toward a single point. Elias knew the tone well. It wasn't a hunt spread wide, but a pack fixed on something, waiting for the kill. He nudged his horse forward, rifle resting loose in its scabbard. Cresting the ridge, he saw it, the cedar post, stark against the fading sky. For a heartbeat, he thought it was empty. Then the wind shifted, tugging at the torn hem of a dress. He drew in a slow breath. A woman. The wolves paced within 50 yards now, their movements a restless half-circle, tails stiff, eyes sharp. He brought the Winchester up smooth to his shoulder. The crack of the shot shattered the stillness, dirt leaping in front of the nearest wolf. The animal skidded back, startled, then loped into the brush. Another lingered too close. Elias chambered again, sending the bullet over its head. The pack broke apart, melting into the low ground. Silence settled hard across the ridge. Elias swung down from his saddle, boots crunching on frozen soil. His eyes scanned the brush, the horizon, every shadow. Trouble was already here. He knew better than to assume it was finished. Up close, the woman looked younger than the distance had made her. Her face was drawn tight with pain, but her eyes, sharp, watching, measuring, held no surrender. She seemed less afraid of the wolves than of him. Elias slid the rifle onto his shoulder and drew the knife from his belt. Without a word, he stepped close enough to smell the dust and sweat clinging to her. The blade slipped under the rope at her wrists. With a quick pull, the fibers gave way. Her arms dropped limp, blood rushing back into her hands, and she nearly collapsed under the weight of her own body. Elias caught her before she hit the ground, one arm firm around her waist. She didn't thank him. Her jaw clenched as she pulled herself upright, refusing his support as soon as she could stand. He crouched, cutting the rope from her ankles, then stepped back, giving her space. He didn't like to crowd people. From the saddle, he fetched his canteen, held it out. She hesitated, then drank, water spilling down her chin in thin rivulets. When he draped his coat over her shoulders, she gripped it tighter than he expected. The wolves hadn't gone far. He could hear them circling wider now. Elias tilted his head toward the horse. She understood. He lifted her into the saddle, swung up behind, his arm steadying her, not in comfort, but to keep her upright. Neither spoke as they left the ridge. Only the creak of leather, the rhythm of the horse's steps, and the cutting wind followed them down into the dark. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The horse carried them slowly down from the ridge, its breath steaming in the cold air. Elias kept one hand on the reins, the other braced lightly against Elara's side to steady her. She leaned forward in the saddle, her body swaying with the animal's movement, too exhausted to protest anymore. Behind them, the cedar post faded into shadow, but neither of them looked back. By the time they reached the canyon mouth, the last of the light had gone. Elias's cabin appeared in the dim glow of a small fire he'd left banked that morning, smoke rising faintly against the rock face. The structure was simple. Rough timbers, a roof patched more than once, the back wall built directly into stone for shelter. To him, it was only a place to keep out the wind, but as he helped her down from the saddle, he noticed her eyes flick across every corner as if measuring whether it was safe enough to stand in. Her legs nearly gave beneath her, so he steadied her by the elbow until she found her balance. She pulled her arm free the moment she could, jaw tight, gaze guarded. Elias didn't take offense. He pushed the door open and nodded for her to step inside first. The cabin air was cold, but at least still, the walls cutting off the bite of the wind. A small table with 2 chairs stood near the stove, shelves lined with jars of beans and coffee, a bed against the far wall. Plain but solid. Elias shut the door behind them, dropped the latch, and set his hat aside. "Set," he said quietly, pointing to the bed. Elara hesitated, eyes narrowing, but finally lowered herself onto the edge. Her shoulders sagged once she was seated, relief slipping through her posture, even if her expression stayed hard. Elias filled a tin cup from the water bucket and handed it to her. She accepted it without a word, drinking carefully, then more greedily as thirst overtook restraint. Water spilled down her chin, soaking into his coat draped across her shoulders. She pulled the fabric tighter afterward, hiding the stains. From beneath the table, he pulled a small box and set a strip of cloth, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and a knife upon it. Her eyes tracked his hands, tensing when he poured liquor over the cloth. "This'll sting," he warned. He pressed the wet cloth to her wrists, where the ropes had left deep grooves. She flinched, lips pressed tight, but didn't pull away. The smell of whiskey filled the cabin, sharp in the small space.
He worked carefully, his fingers steady, wrapping the raw skin with clean strips. Elara studied him the whole time, silent, as if trying to weigh his intent. Her gaze searched for some hidden cost behind his actions, some sign that his kindness was only another trap.
Elias offered nothing more than the work of his hands. When he finished, he stepped back, giving her space. "Eat," he said, sliding a plate of beans and bread toward her from the stove. She hesitated again, then picked up the bread. The first bite was small, cautious. The second was larger. Within minutes, she was eating steadily, each motion deliberate, as though careful not to waste a crumb. Elias leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching only enough to know she would finish the meal. He didn't ask questions, he didn't demand thanks. In his experience, words too quickly spoken often cost more than they gave. For the first time in hours, Elara's hands stopped trembling. She kept her eyes low, fixed on the plate, but the tightness in her jaw eased. For now, she accepted his care, not with trust, but with necessity. And for Elias, that was enough. The cabin settled into quiet once the meal was gone. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls with a steady moan, rattling the shutters and tugging faintly at the roof tarps. Inside, only the faint crackle from the stove and the low scrape of Elias's boots across the floor filled the space.
Elara sat still on the bed, the empty plate resting beside her. The color had returned slightly to her face, though her eyes remained sharp and guarded. She kept his coat pulled close, her fingers curling into the worn lining like it was a lifeline. Elias cleared the tin cup from the table and poured more water into the bucket. He moved without hurry, his presence steady, never forcing her into conversation. When he finally turned back toward her, his gaze softened, though his voice stayed even. "You'll take the bed tonight," he said. Her brow tightened. "And you?" "I'll take the floor." Suspicion flickered through her expression. Men who offered comfort so freely often carried hidden debts. But Elias simply reached for his saddle roll, laying it out near the door. He spread his coat across it, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Elara studied him a long moment, searching again for what he wanted in return. He gave her nothing, no expectation, no hint of a bargain, only space. He leaned his rifle against the wall beside him, then lowered himself onto the floorboards with a grunt. One arm folded behind his head, he watched the stove glow through half-lidded eyes.
Elara shifted slowly onto the bed. The mattress was rough, stuffed with straw, but compared to the cedar post, it was softer than any she remembered. Her body ached from standing so long, wrists raw, legs trembling. The warmth of the blanket he had left folded at the end of the bed seeped into her bones. Silence stretched between them. It was not the silence of strangers, sharp with tension, but the kind that came when words were unnecessary. Still, Elara could not stop herself from asking, her voice low, uncertain. "Why are you doing this?" Elias opened his eyes fully then, turning his head toward her. For a moment he said nothing. His gaze lingered on the firelight before he finally spoke. "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers," he murmured, his tone thoughtful, almost like he was speaking more to himself than to her. "For by so doing, some have entertained angels without knowing it." Elara blinked, surprised at the verse, at the weight of it hanging in the cabin air. She had not expected faith to linger in the voice of a man who carried himself like a drifter. She looked away, toward the flames, but her grip on his coat softened. She did not answer him. Not with words, but for the first time since he had cut her down from the post, she allowed herself to breathe deeper, her shoulders easing against the blanket. Elias closed his eyes again, listening to the wind drag across the canyon. He knew sleep would come lightly, as it always did. But he also knew that tonight, for the first time in many winters, the cabin no longer felt entirely empty. And for Elara, though her doubts still pressed against her ribs, the thoughts settled quietly inside her. Perhaps not every stranger was an enemy. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers by the time dawn pressed gray light through the shutters. Elias stirred first, as he always did. Years of drifting had made him a light sleeper, never far from the edge of wakefulness. He rose quietly, stoked the coals back to flame, and set a tin of coffee on the heat. The scrape of metal on iron must have reached her, because when he turned, Elara was already awake. She lay still on the bed, eyes open, watching him through strands of loose dark hair. There was no panic in her gaze now, only a quiet calculation. "You sleep?" he asked. "A little," she replied. Her voice was rough, as though it hadn't been used in days. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, sitting up slowly. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, setting one on the table near her. She hesitated, then crossed the small space and sat opposite him. Her fingers wrapped around the warm tin, and for the first time he saw her shoulders relax. Not much, but enough to tell him she hadn't sat at a table in some time. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint bubbling of the pot on the stove. Elias didn't rush it. He had learned long ago that forcing talk often meant hearing lies. He let the moment breathe until she chose to speak. "You could have left me," she said finally. The words were flat, without accusation, as though she was simply naming a fact. "I could have," Elias agreed. He sipped his coffee, eyes steady on hers. Didn't seem right. Her gaze dropped to the steam rising from her cup. For a while she said nothing more. Then her jaw tightened, and she set the tin down carefully. "My cousin," she said. The words came slow, like stones pried loose from a wall. "After my father died, his rifle should have been mine. A Springfield. He wanted it. When I refused, he told the others I had sold myself to outsiders, said I brought shame." Elias didn't flinch, though something in his eyes narrowed. "And they believed him?" "Some did," she answered. "Some didn't care if it was true." Her fingers tightened around the tin. "Either way, they tied me to the post, left the wolves to finish it." Elias leaned back slightly, the wood chair creaking beneath him. He studied her face, the lines of exhaustion and quiet anger etched deep. "That why you didn't cry out?" Her eyes snapped up, sharp. Crying wouldn't have changed their minds. He gave a single nod. Her words carried no self-pity, only a hard truth. "Then he'll come again," Elias said after a moment. "If he hears you're alive, he'll want to finish what he started." She didn't hesitate. "Yes, he will." The cabin fell quiet again, save for the hiss of the fire. Elias set his cup aside and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. He checked the action, slid the bolt back with a practiced hand. "Then we'll be ready," he said simply. Elara studied him across the table, her face unreadable. But for the first time, her eyes held something different, a flicker, faint but undeniable. Not trust, not yet, but the recognition of someone who had chosen to stand between her and the wolves, both the kind with fangs and the kind that wore human faces. By midday, the frost had lifted from the canyon floor, leaving damp patches of soil dark against the pale ground. Elias stepped outside to check the corral and split more wood. The air was still, the kind that carried sound farther than it should. He moved slow, scanning out of habit. That was when he saw them, 2 sets of hoofprints cutting through the soft earth, fresh enough that the edges still held sharp. They hadn't been there yesterday. The tracks angled close to the cabin, close enough for anyone passing to see the faint smoke from his chimney. Elias crouched low, fingers brushing the impressions. One horse heavy, the other lighter, both shod. Whoever they were, they had ridden past during the night. He followed the trail a short distance until it disappeared into rock and sage. The prints didn't turn back. Whoever rode them hadn't stopped, but they had come close enough to mark this place. When he returned inside, Elara looked up from the table. She was mending a tear in the coat he'd given her with a length of twine, but her hands stilled when she saw his face. "Riders?" she asked quietly. "2," Elias said. "Passed by close, didn't linger, but they'll know someone's here." She drew in a slow breath, then nodded. "If it's them, they'll tell him." He said nothing. He didn't have to. Both of them knew what that meant. The rest of the morning passed under a weight neither spoke of. Elias cut wood while she kept the stove burning, but both of them glanced often at the door, the windows, the stretch of canyon beyond. It was late afternoon when they came. The sound reached first, hoofbeats steady, deliberate. Elias stepped outside, leaning against the fence post as two riders approached across the flat. One wore a blue army coat, its faded fabric flapping against the wind. The other had a pale scar running from cheekbone to jaw, a mark visible even at distance. They reined in 20 yards from the corral. "Afternoon," the scarred man called, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Heard tell you've been seen with a woman. Patch girl, dark hair.
About yay-high." His hand lifted casually, measuring invisible air. Elias let the silence stretch. Then he shrugged once. "Haven't had company in months. You might want to check your sources." The man in the army coat scanned the cabin, his eyes narrowing at the faint smoke drifting from the chimney. "We know she was out near the ridge. Wolves don't cut ropes. Somebody did." Elias's hand rested near his revolver, loose but ready. His voice stayed even. "You calling me a liar?" Neither answered, but their horses shifted uneasily under the stillness. The scarred man leaned forward slightly, the smile fading from his lips. "If she's here, you'll regret it." Elias didn't move. His gaze stayed steady, flat as stone. "Then you've wasted a ride." The silence stretched until the horses snorted and pawed at the dirt. Finally, the men pulled their reins, turning away with stiff shoulders. "We'll be back," the scarred one said. "Bring whoever you want," Elias replied, his voice calm. "Won't change the answer." They rode off slow, making sure he saw they weren't in a hurry. Elias stayed by the fence until the sound of their hoofbeats faded.
Only then did he let the breath ease from his chest. Inside, Elara was waiting by the door, her hands tight around the rifle he had left propped against the wall. She met his eyes without speaking. He gave a short nod. Trouble had found them, and it would be back. The days that followed carried a rhythm neither of them spoke about, but both of them fell into it. At first light, Elias stepped outside to scan the horizon before splitting wood, the steady thud of the axe marking the silence of the canyon. Elara, still wrapped in his coat against the morning cold, lit the stove and boiled coffee, the smell carrying through the small cabin. It was work, plain and necessary, yet it filled the hours with something more than waiting. One morning, Elias paused mid-swing and saw her standing at the woodpile. She picked up the axe without a word, set a log upright, and swung. The blade bit clean, the wood falling in two neat pieces. She reset another and did it again, her arms moving with practiced strength. He leaned against the fence rail, watching a moment. "Didn't figure you'd done much chopping." She looked up, strands of hair falling into her face. "You think I can't?" "I think you can," he said simply, then returned to stacking his pile. The faintest curve touched her mouth, gone as quickly as it came. But the silence that followed was lighter than before. Inside, the cabin began to feel less like a stopover and more like a place being lived in. Elara mended torn seams with steady hands, turning scraps of cloth into useful patches. She cooked rabbit stew one evening, the scent filling the room, until Elias found himself almost forgetting the tension outside. He sat at the table while she stirred the pot, the lamplight catching the sharp lines of her face, softening them. When she set a bowl before him, he nodded once. "Smells better than the beans I burn." "You don't season them," she replied flatly. Then, after a pause, "My father taught me." The mention of her father hung in the air. Elias didn't press, but he saw the way her hand lingered on the wooden spoon, her jaw tightening at the memory. Later, after the meal, she sat by the stove sewing, while Elias cleaned his rifle at the table. The lamplight flickered across the barrel, catching on the oiled steel. He glanced up at her, the needle moving quick and sure in her fingers, and thought, not for the first time, that she didn't belong tied to a post, abandoned to wolves. He didn't say it aloud. Instead, he offered her the knife he kept at his belt. "Show me how you use it." She rose, took the blade, and set her stance in the narrow space between table and wall. Her movements were quick, short strikes without wasted motion, like someone who had been taught early. Elias nodded once. "You'll do." She handed the knife back, her eyes meeting his for a moment longer than before. Something unspoken passed there. Not trust yet, but recognition. That night, when the wind howled against the shutters, they ate stew in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not strangers forced together, but two people sharing a space against the dark. For Elias, it was the first time in years he didn't feel the cabin pressing in on him like a cage. For Elara, it was the first time since the cedar post that she allowed herself to think survival might mean more than just staying alive. The wind shifted the second night, carrying a sharper bite through the cracks of the shutters. Elias sat at the table, oiling his Winchester for the third time that day. The rifle didn't need it, he simply wanted no doubt about its readiness. Across the cabin, Elara sat on the edge of the bed, patching the last of the seams in her dress. Her hands moved steadily, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, as if she could feel something out there pressing closer. When she finished, she set the cloth aside and looked toward him. Why? Elias glanced up from the rifle. Why what? Why cut me down? Her voice was steady, but beneath it lay the weight of hours tied to the post, abandoned by those who should have stood with her. You didn't know me. You could have ridden past. He set the rifle aside, leaning back in the chair. For a long moment, the firelight flickered between them, filling the silence. Then his voice came low, even. "I've seen too many left to die because nobody wanted the trouble. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And what if I bring the trouble here?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "Then I'll deal with it here." The words were plain, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. Elara looked away first, her hands curling into the fabric of his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She held it tight, as though the rough lining might keep away more than just the cold. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire popped, the wind clawed faintly at the roof, and in that quiet she found herself breathing easier. His answer hadn't been given like a promise meant to soothe her. It had been spoken like fact, immovable as stone. When she finally looked back at him, her expression had softened. Most men wouldn't have bothered. Elias gave a faint shrug. "Most men aren't me." Her mouth twitched at that, something close to the beginning of a smile, though it never quite formed. But her eyes lingered on him longer than before, and for the first time since he had cut her free, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was safe. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the shutters hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Elias's gaze shifted toward the door, the line between his brows deepening. "Storm's coming," he muttered. Elara followed his eyes, listening. She wasn't sure if he meant the weather or the men who would surely return. Perhaps both. That night, when he rolled his blanket out by the door again, she didn't just watch him from the shadows. Her voice came soft, almost hesitant. "Good night, Elias." He turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes across the dim firelight. "Good night." It was the smallest of exchanges, but it carried more weight than either of them admitted. For her, it was the first step away from suspicion. For him, it was the first sign that she no longer saw him as just another man with a gun. The cabin grew quiet, the storm building somewhere beyond the ridge. And in the stillness, both of them knew the true test had yet to come. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The night carried a stillness that felt wrong. No coyotes called across the flats, no wind rattled the brush. Elias sat at the table with his rifle across his lap, eyes on the shuttered window. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting only a dim glow against the cabin walls. Elara was awake, too. She sat on the bed with the spare Winchester resting across her knees, her hands steady, though her eyes betrayed the weight of waiting. Every creak of timber, every shift in the night air made her lift her head, listening. Then it came, the faint rhythm of hooves against frozen soil. Slow, deliberate. Elias rose, moving to the window, lifting the shutter just enough to see. Shadows approached across the flats, 5 riders spread in a loose half-circle. He recognized the scarred face of one, the tattered blue army coat of another. And leading them, taller in the saddle, shoulders broad and posture proud, was the man he had not yet seen but already knew, her cousin. The riders halted just beyond the yard. The cousin's voice carried across the cold air, calm but sharp as a blade. "Luke Hartman," he called. "Last chance, send the girl out. This doesn't need blood." Elias pushed the shutter closed. He looked back at Elara, who had risen to her feet, jaw tight, eyes dark. "He won't leave without me," she whispered. Elias loaded a round into the chamber with a soft click. "Then he won't leave with you either." The cousin's voice came again, sharper now. "You're harboring what doesn't belong to you. Step aside, or we take her." Elias lifted the bar from the door, slid it back into place with a solid thud. His voice when he answered was steady, flat, carrying through the walls. "You already did your leaving when you tied her to a post. You won't be finishing it here tonight." Fell outside. The horses shifted, hooves stamping at the dirt. Then the cousin spoke again, louder, anger coiled beneath the calm. "Then you've chosen your side." Inside, Elara's grip tightened on the rifle. She glanced at Elias, searching his face. He didn't look back, his focus fixed on the door. His stance, the way he held the rifle, it told her everything. He had made his choice before he ever fired at the wolves. The stillness broke with a sudden crack, a rifle shot, close, slamming into the wall of the cabin. Splinters of wood spat into the room. Elara flinched but did not move from her place. Elias shifted to the window, resting the barrel of his Winchester against the frame. "Stay low," he murmured. For a heartbeat, Elara's breath caught in her chest. The post, the ropes, the wolves, those memories pressed against her ribs, urging her to run, to hide. But she forced herself to steady, to breathe. She was not prey anymore. Another voice shouted from outside, rough and eager, "Burn them out!" The words carried like a spark into dry grass. Elias narrowed his eyes, finger curling on the trigger. The point of no return had come. The first bullet struck the cabin wall again, sending another spray of splinters into the room. Elias ducked low, swinging the shutter open just wide enough to aim. He fired once, the crack of the Winchester tearing through the night. A rider's force screamed, rearing hard, and its rider tumbled into the dirt. The others shouted, chaos breaking their tight formation. "Circle them!" a voice barked. Elara dropped flat as another shot punched through the window frame. Her pulse hammered, but her hands moved with a steadiness born of something deeper than fear. She slid the spare Winchester against her shoulder, eyes narrowing as shadows shifted outside. Elias kept his shots controlled, every squeeze of the trigger measured. A second man staggered from his saddle, cursing, clutching at his arm as his horse bolted into the dark. The cousin shouted again, his voice cutting across the gunfire. "Hold steady, they're only 2!" Only 2, but 2 willing to stand. Elias ducked back from the window, reloading quick. "Your turn," he said, handing Elara a fresh round. Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, the memory of the post clawed at her, the helplessness, the ropes cutting deep. But her father's voice echoed in memory, steady and low, teaching her how to aim a rifle when she was barely tall enough to hold it. She loaded, rose to one knee, and aimed through the gap in the shutter. A rider charged closer, pistol flashing. She exhaled slow, just as her father had taught. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the shot echoing hard across the flats. The man's hat flew from his head as he jerked backward, tumbling from the saddle into the dust. His horse wheeled and bolted.
Elias glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, followed quickly by a nod of approval. Good. The cousin's men broke, pulling back into the dark. Only the sound of hooves lingered, fading beyond the ridge. One body lay still in the yard, another moaned faintly where he had fallen. The cousin himself had not fired, had not pressed forward. He lingered in the dark, watching, before finally calling out.
"This isn't finished." His voice carried a promise sharp enough to cut. Then the last of the riders disappeared into the night, leaving silence heavy against the cabin walls. Elara lowered the rifle slowly, her arms trembling now that the firing had stopped. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and bitter, filling her lungs. She sat back hard against the wall, pressing the stock of the Winchester against her knees. Her hand shook, but her eyes were fierce. For the first time since the cedar post, she had not only stood, she had fought back. Elias reloaded with practiced calm, scanning the yard through the broken shutter. He didn't relax. "They'll regroup," he said quietly. Elara nodded once, her jaw tight. She understood. Tonight had been a battle, not the war. Still, when her eyes met his in the dim firelight, there was something different there. No longer just desperation. Something harder, sharper, resolve. The gunfire had faded, but the silence it left behind was heavier than before. Smoke clung inside the cabin, seeping through the gaps in the shutters, mingling with the bitter smell of gun oil and dust. Elias pushed the bar back across the door and stood for a long moment, listening. Nothing but the faint moan of the wounded man outside, carried thin on the night air. Elara sat near the stove, the Winchester across her lap. Her hands still trembled, though her eyes stayed sharp, fixed on the door as if she expected it to splinter open at any second. Elias moved to the window, scanning the yard once more. "They'll be back," he said at last, "and next time they'll bring more." She nodded, her jaw tight. "I know." He turned toward her then, studying the way she sat. Straight-backed despite the exhaustion, the rifle held like it belonged to her. He had seen plenty of people fight because they had no choice. But this was different. She was holding something deeper than survival. "You could still run," he said quietly. "They'd chase you, but you might lose them in the flats." Her gaze snapped to him, fierce, almost angry. "Run? That's what he wants, to drive me off, to take what's mine, and leave me with nothing." Elias folded his arms, waiting. She drew a breath, steadying herself. "My father's rifle, a Springfield. He gave it to me before he died. Said it was mine. Said it was our blood, carried in steel and wood. My cousin took it the day after the burial. Told everyone I wasn't fit to keep it. That's why he lied, why he tied me to that post." Her voice cracked, not with tears, but with the weight of memory. She tightened her grip on the Winchester, the knuckles of her hand pale against the stock. "If I leave without it, then everything he said becomes truth. That I was weak, that I brought shame. I won't give him that." Elias studied her for a long moment. He could see it now, the fire in her words, the way she sat straighter as she spoke. It wasn't just about a rifle. It was about honor, about the line she refused to let him cross. Finally, he nodded once. "Then we'll get it back." Elara blinked, surprised at the certainty in his tone. "You do that?" "I didn't pull you from that post just to watch you crawl away beaten," Elias said. His voice was even, but the steel beneath it was clear. "If that rifle's your line, then it's mine too now." The fire popped in the stove, sending sparks against the iron. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was no longer heavy with fear, but with resolve. Ilara's hands stopped trembling. She leaned back slowly, drawing in a steady breath. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe they might not just survive, they might win. The morning broke cold and pale, the canyon rim dusted with frost that glinted under the first reach of sunlight. Elias stepped outside to check the corral, rifle in hand. The air was sharp, every sound carrying farther than usual. He scanned the flats with a scout's eye, the way he had years ago when danger was never more than a ridge away. That was when he saw it, a thin column of smoke, rising slow against the pale horizon. Too far for a campfire from a traveler, too deliberate to be an accident. He crouched near the fence post, narrowing his eyes. The smoke came from the south ridge, the very draw where riders had disappeared into the night. They hadn't gone far. They were waiting, regrouping. He stood slowly, jaw tightening. For a long moment, he simply watched the plume twist skyward, then turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Elara was already awake, stirring the embers of the stove into a low fire. She glanced up at him the moment he entered, reading his face before he spoke.
"Smoke," he said simply. "South Ridge. They've camped close." Her hand stilled on the poker. She straightened, eyes narrowing. "They're not done." "No," Elias said. He set his rifle against the table, not by a long stretch. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the stove. Then Elara stood fully, her shoulders squared. "If we wait, they'll come with more, burn this cabin to the ground." Elias nodded once, "Which means we don't wait." Her gaze snapped to him, sharp, searching. "You mean—" "We go to them," he said. His tone carried no hesitation, no room for doubt. "End it before they have the chance to end us." The words settled heavy between them, but they carried truth. Hiding behind walls only delayed the fight. Out there, with open ground and a clear plan, they might stand a chance. Elara drew in a breath. Fear flickered in her eyes, but it didn't take hold. Instead, she stepped closer, steadying her voice. "Then I'll fight beside you." Elias looked at her a long moment. She had been a stranger bound to a post, barely clinging to breath. Now she stood with fire in her eyes, claiming the fight as her own. He gave a short nod. "Then we ride at first light tomorrow." The decision settled over the cabin like iron. No going back, no turning aside. Whatever came next, it would be faced head-on. That night, neither of them slept deeply. Elias lay near the door, rifle within arm's reach. Elara rested on the bed, one hand curled around the spare Winchester even in her dreams. Outside, the smoke on the horizon thinned and spread, a silent reminder that the storm was gathering. Tomorrow, they would ride into it. The dawn came with a pale fire, streaks of rose and gold cutting across the canyon sky. Frost crunched under the horses' hooves as Elias led them south, keeping low along the washes. Elara rode beside him, the borrowed Winchester steady across her lap. She wore his old coat pulled tight, her dark hair tucked back against the wind. Neither spoke. The silence between them carried the weight of what lay ahead. By the time they reached the ridge, the smoke was still rising, faint but steady. Elias slowed the horse, dismounted, and motioned for Elara to follow on foot. They moved through the brush, every step measured, until the camp came into view. 3 horses were tied near a pinyon pine. 2 men crouched by a low fire, while a third sat apart, the Springfield rifle resting across his knees. Even at distance, Elara knew it instantly, the long stock, the worn steel. Her breath caught, her cousin. He looked different in the pale light, older somehow, though the arrogance still hung on him like armor. His head lifted, eyes narrowing, and a slow smile touched his mouth as he spotted them. "Well," he said, rising to his feet, "look who crawled out of hiding." Elias stepped forward, rifle leveled, his voice steady. "Set the rifle down." The cousin laughed once, sharp and short. "This belongs to me now. She forfeited it when she shamed her blood." Elara moved from behind Elias then, her own rifle raised. Her voice rang clear across the camp. "That's a lie, and you know it. My father gave it to me. You stole it." Her cousin's smile thinned, but his grip on the Springfield didn't falter. "And what will you do about it? Hide behind another man's gun?" For a moment, the air held still, tension stretched to breaking.
Then Elara took another step forward, eyes locked on his. Not hide. Stand! Elias kept his rifle trained on the other two men, but he felt the shift. This wasn't his fight to finish. It was hers. The cousin sneered. "You'd kill kin for a piece of wood and steel?" Ilara's voice was steady, carrying more than defiance. It carried conviction. "It isn't the rifle. It's my father's word, his honor, and I won't let you bury it under lies." The fire cracked low, sparks lifting into the cold morning air. Elias spoke then, his tone even, but edged with something harder. "Romans says, 'Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.' She's standing here with truth. You've got nothing but theft." The cousin's jaw tightened. For a long moment, it seemed the standoff might shatter into blood. Then, slowly, he lowered the Springfield. His eyes stayed locked on Elara, fury burning, but his hands loosened. He set the rifle on the ground. Ilara's chest rose and fell, her breath sharp in the cold air. She stepped forward, picked up the Springfield, and held it close to her chest. For the first time since her father's death, she felt whole. The cousin's voice came low, venomous. "This isn't over." Elara met his eyes, unflinching.
For me, it is. The Springfield felt heavy in Elara's hands, not with weight, but with meaning. The worn wood pressed against her palm carried her father's voice, his promise, his trust. She held it steady against her chest, refusing to let her cousin's gaze shake her resolve. The camp was still. Elias kept his rifle raised on the other two men, their hands hovering near their holsters but never daring to draw. The cousin stood a few paces away, his jaw tight, his fury so sharp it seemed to crackle in the cold air. "You've made your choice," he said finally, his voice low and venomous. "Don't expect to come back." Elara lifted her chin. "I'm not coming back. Not now, not ever." Her tone was calm, stripped of anger. It was simply truth. The cousin's nostrils flared, but he gave no further answer. With a sharp motion of his head, he turned toward his men. "Mount up." The two obeyed quickly, relief in their haste. The cousin lingered a moment longer, his glare flicking from Elara to Elias. "You think this ends here," he spat, "but blood remembers." Elias's voice cut through, even and unshaken. "So does truth." The cousin swung into the saddle, spurred his horse hard, and the three of them thundered off into the flats. Their dust hung in the morning light until even the sound of their hooves faded. Only then did Elias lower his rifle. He turned toward Elara, who still clutched the Springfield. Her shoulders sagged, but not with weakness, with release. She exhaled, the breath fogging in the cold, and finally lowered the rifle to her side. "It's mine again," she said quietly. Elias nodded. "Always was." They stood together for a long while, the silence between them no longer heavy with fear, but lighter, like something had been broken open. The air was sharp, but for the first time since the cedar post, Elara felt warmth spread through her chest. On the ride back, neither spoke much. The canyon walls caught the sun as it climbed, painting the stone in gold. Elara kept the Springfield across her lap, her hand resting on the stock as though afraid it might vanish if she let go. When the cabin finally came into view, tucked against the rock face with smoke curling from its chimney, Elias slowed the horse. He glanced at her, his eyes steady but questioning. "You could go," he said quietly. "Take the rifle. Start again somewhere else. No shame in that." Elara looked at him a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the morning light. Then she shook her head. "No, I'm staying. Not because I owe you, but because I want to." Elias studied her, the truth of her words settling deep. After years of wandering, of empty days and colder nights, something stirred in him, a sense of belonging he had almost forgotten. He gave a short nod.
Then we'll make this place ours." As they dismounted and led the horse into the corral, the ridge stood quiet behind them. No riders, no smoke. For now, the threat was gone. And for the first time, the cabin did not feel like a lone man's shelter. It felt like a home. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The ride back was quiet. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the distant cry of a hawk circling above the canyon rim. The sun had climbed higher, burning off the frost, and the ground shimmered faintly where the cold earth met the light. Elara kept the Springfield across her lap, one hand resting on the stock as if it might vanish if she let it go. The weapon was more than steel and wood. It was proof that her father's word had not been buried, that her cousin's lies could not erase the truth. Every bump of the trail pressed the rifle against her palm, reminding her she had reclaimed more than a piece of her past. She had reclaimed herself. When the cabin came into view, tucked against the canyon wall with thin smoke curling from the chimney, Elias slowed the horse. He dismounted first, then reached up to steady her as she slid down. She hesitated before taking his hand, but when her boots touched the ground, she didn't pull away so quickly as she had before. The yard bore scars of the night before. A patch of churned soil where a horse had fallen, a broken shutter hanging askew, a dark stain near the corral where one man had bled into the earth before his companions dragged him away. The silence pressed against them, not empty, but full of what had been endured. Elias scanned the horizon one more time, then nodded. "We'll clean it up." Together they set to work.
Elias dragged the broken boards into a pile while Elara fetched water to wash the blood from the dirt. The work was hard, unspoken, but not heavy. Each task cleared a piece of the night's shadow, each motion reclaiming the ground as theirs. When the yard was finally clean, Elias straightened, leaning on the handle of the shovel. Elara stood beside the water bucket, her sleeves damp, her hair falling loose around her face. She looked at the cabin, not with suspicion, as she had the first night, nor with weariness, but with something steadier: belonging. Inside, Elias patched the broken shutter while Elara laid the Springfield carefully in the corner by the bed. She ran her hand along the stock one last time before turning to the stove. The scent of stew rose slowly through the cabin as she stirred the pot, the sound of her movements soft against the crackle of fire. Elias set the hammer down and watched her for a moment. She moved with quiet purpose, her hands sure, her shoulders no longer weighed down with fear. He thought of the woman he had found tied to the cedar post, skin raw from ropes, eyes burning with defiance even in her despair. Now she stood in his cabin, not broken, but unyielding. When she noticed his gaze, she met it evenly. "It smells better than your beans," she said, a faint curve at the corner of her mouth. He gave a rare smile, small but real. Most things do. They ate together at the table, the fire warming the walls, the air outside turning colder as the sun slipped behind the ridge. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel the silence pressing in on him like a weight. It was no longer the quiet of loneliness, but of peace. After the meal, Elara set the pot aside and sat across from him. She laid her hand on the Springfield strap, then looked at him. "You said once you never had a place to be. Maybe this is one now." Elias studied her words, the truth of them reflected in the steady light of her eyes. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him, and let out a slow breath. "Maybe it is." The fire burned low, painting the cabin walls in soft orange. Outside, the canyon stretched silent and wide, holding the memory of what had passed. Inside, two lives, once broken, once wandering, had begun to weave into something new. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter against the world. It felt like home. The dawn that followed was different. The silence of the canyon no longer felt like warning, but like rest. A thin mist clung low to the flats, silver under the first light, and the air smelled of cedar smoke from the cabin stove. Elias rose early, as he always did, but when he stepped outside the door, he didn't carry the same weight of caution in his chest.
He still scanned the ridges, the horizon, the faint traces of hoofprints that had scarred the ground days before. But there was nothing now, no smoke from enemy camps, no distant riders, just the wide stillness of the land. When he returned inside, Elara was already awake, seated at the table with the Springfield across her knees. She wasn't gripping it tight anymore. Instead, she ran a cloth along the barrel, polishing the worn steel as though tending to something sacred. "You keep that rifle close," Elias said quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "I will, not because I'm afraid anymore, but because it reminds me who I am." Elias nodded, pulling a tin cup from the shelf. He poured coffee for them both, setting one before her. She wrapped her hands around the warmth, her fingers no longer trembling like they had that first night. For a while they drank in silence. The fire popped in the stove, and outside the sun climbed higher, gilding the canyon rim in gold. Finally, Elara broke the quiet. "You've given me more than shelter," she said. "You gave me a chance to stand again." Elias studied her across the table. He thought of the first moment he had seen her. Tied to a cedar post, skin raw from rope, eyes defiant even as the wolves circled. And now she sat here, shoulders straight, voice steady, claiming her place in the world. He set his cup down. "I didn't give it to you, you took it. I only cut the rope." For the first time she smiled, small but real. It reached her eyes, softening them in a way he hadn't seen before. They spent the rest of the morning working side by side. Elias repaired the last of the boards on the shutter, while Elara tended to the fire and laid out strips of venison to dry. The rhythm was quiet, steady, almost ordinary, and in that ordinariness lay its power. At midday, they walked the ridge together. The air was clear, the horizon stretched endless and empty. Elias stopped near the cedar post, still standing in the earth where Elias had first found her. The rope was gone, but the scars it left in the wood remained. She touched it once, fingertips brushing the splintered grain. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in memory. Then she stepped back, her eyes sharp. "I won't ever be tied here again." Elias's gaze lingered on her, then on the vast sweep of the land. "No," he said quietly, "you won't." They turned back toward the cabin as the sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the flats. When they reached the door, Elia paused, looking at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the walls patched with new boards, at the horse shifting in the corral. She drew in a long breath. "This place, it doesn't feel like yours anymore," she said softly. Then she looked at him, steady. "It feels like ours." Elias held her gaze, the truth of her words settling deep in his chest. For years he had drifted, carrying nothing but miles and memories. Now, for the first time since burying his wife, he felt the ground solid beneath him. He gave a slow nod. "Then ours it is." The sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving the canyon bathed in soft twilight. Inside, the stove glowed warm, and the cabin stood not as a shelter against fear, but as the beginning of something new. Together they stepped inside, closing the door against the dark, and for the first time, neither of them felt alone. Stories like this are more than tales of rifles and riders. They are echoes of a time when every choice could mean life or death, when honor weighed heavier than gold, and when the wild was both a threat and a promise. For many of you watching, perhaps it brings back memories of fathers who taught you right from wrong, of mothers who held a home together with faith and fire, of nights when silence spoke louder than words. In these true Wild West stories, we don't just find history, we find reminders of resilience, of trust hard won, and of the quiet strength that still lives in us today. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in the old ways, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your story matters too.